Welcome to this session. We'll be using this room for all the tracks on Africa Sun, on Leave No One Behind, The Last Mile, Inequalities. Any conversation related to that will be happening in this room. First and foremost, I'd like to apologize for the late start. Not that it is anything to do with me or it's my responsibility, but I owe it to you as the chair of the theme to apologize for the late start. We just got communication that we have to wait another 15 minutes, which we can't afford to, and that the time also has been cut from 1 hour to less. So we are supposed to stop at 1:15, which I don't agree to, but unfortunately there is something else that will be happening at that time that we are supposed to be involved in as well. There will be an award that will be given for inclusion that I think we need to be in that session as well. So I will request that you bear with us. We have very interesting presentations. It will get very exciting as we start, but we have to be aware of time. So I'm politely saying to the presenters, be kind to us. And for the audience, be engaging. So allow me to introduce our first session, which will be chaired by, so we are having two organizations co-convening this session. I will just read the title, and then someone else will come and introduce the two organizations and get into the session without wasting time. So our session is, I'm sure it is indicated in your folders, Challenges and Opportunities in Rural and Urban Sanitation in Africa. So we have SNV, where we have Ann Muta, and then we have Seri Alana Porter. Thank you. Please come.
Very good. Thank you very much, Elizabeth Wamera. So she's the track lead for all the work on Leave No One Behind, and we're starting with the best session today on that topic. And it's going to be on challenges and opportunities in rural and urban sanitation. We'll first have a block focusing on rural sanitation with experiences from multiple countries here in Africa. And then we'll have a block talking specifically about informal settlements in South Africa, so talking about challenges in urban sanitation. And what we really want to get across here is that it is very important to understand current realities and to build on what is already there together with people to realize their right to sanitation. So I'd like to ask Anna Muta to come to the front. Anna Muta is working with SNV. She's SNV's multi-country program manager for the Sustainable Sanitation and Hygiene Results Program. It's a rural sanitation program running in 7 countries in Africa. And she will tell the story about how we try to define what affordability in rural sanitation means. And I, of course, forgot to tell you that my name is Antoinette Komen. But those of you with very good eyesight have already noticed that. So I also work at SNV, and I will try to facilitate things as they go along. Anne, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the session on determining affordability of sanitation, looking at the rural households in Africa. So I think many of us, when we go shopping, most of the time you look at the price of the product, and then you decide whether you want to buy it or not, either because of the amount of resources that you have in your pocket, or based on if you have a credit card available. So the big question is, do rural households make decisions using the same process? And before I get into the detail of how we've determined affordability, I'd like to share with you the model that SNV uses for rural sanitation, which is based on a framework with 4 pillars, and not in any order of priority. We are based on the context that we are working in. We work around WASH governance, which is about improving the enabling environment from the national to subnational levels around WASH issues. The second pillar looks at sanitation demand creation, and in this pillar we are looking at working with households or communities to help them to understand the urgency around the need for safe or improved sanitation. The third pillar is looking at hygiene and behavior change communication, and this centers around toilet use and maintenance. Once rural households have invested in toilets, how are they being used and how are they being maintained? And the last pillar, which is the focus of our work today, is looking at sanitation supply chains and finance. Our work on affordability is anchored under this pillar, and we look at both the supply and the demand side in the context that we are working in to understand the dynamics between these two, and then design interventions that are addressing the barriers. So in terms of affordability, trying to define a few concepts in how we are using it. We say that the affordability of the cost of a product, which is here, is based on two decisions that the household has to make. One is looking at the upfront investment, which could be in terms of the money, which is, do I have the money now? Can I pay for it later? How much does it cost? It looks at the aspect of time. When can I have this product? Can I get it right away, or I have to wait? And the third bit around the upfront investment is the labor. Can I do it myself, or do I have to go and source it from somewhere else? And if I'm sourcing it from somewhere else, how much does it cost? And then, of course, we hope that there are also decisions around maintaining it through the life cycle. I'm sure many of you have seen the RC life cycle cost work that was done. So the upfront cost and the maintenance cost lead to the cost. But before you can define affordability, we need to also look at the spending capacity of these households. So comparing the cost and the spending capacity helps us to define whether the product is affordable or not to the household. So our approach to affordability, we are saying that the big question we have here is, how do we define whether it's affordable or not? And we say that at least 80% of the households that are within the 4 wealth quintiles, so looking from the richest to the poor, are able to afford it. And if 80% of these households are not able to afford it, then there could be some barriers they're experiencing, or there's something that needs to be improved in terms of the product to make it affordable. And that we also recognize that there's a 20% that will not be able to afford. So again, it's what kind of interventions would you have for this 20% that's not able to afford the product? So the methodology that you're looking at is trying to monitor whether the affordability of the product changes through time based on our analysis of the barriers towards the affordability of that project. I hope it's not too many affordability issues. And how do we assess that? I think the first instance, when we started the project, the result-based component of the project commenced in 2014. And when we started it, we used the human rights to water proposition that the cost of sanitation should not be more than 5% of the household income. The challenges we faced with that was, one, incomes vary within a country or even within countries. Secondly is the seasonality of incomes. So households, especially in rural areas, do not have incomes on a monthly basis. This one depends probably on the harvests or how many harvest seasons they have. And then the third bit is the reliability of the income data. And we thought, okay, if you look at the different aspects of the income data we have for rural households, most of it is very varied and might not reflect the true nature of the issues at the household level. So we thought that it would be good to look at a different model. And that's why we came up with a model which looks at the key assets. So the key assets is on two propositions. One, we conduct household surveys to measure progress to access to sanitation in all the countries we are operating, or at least within the sustainable hygiene for all project. And in the household survey, we have the demographic health survey wealth modules that look at some of the assets that these households have. And using that means that there's consistency across the country survey, the country assets that can be used to generate the information that we require. Secondly, again, from the household surveys that we conduct, we hold focus group discussions with households that fall within the 2 poorest well quintiles. So that's the poorest and the poor. And the participants of the FGD are identified from the survey, and we make sure that it provides diversity of the group. So male, female households, male and female-headed households, looking at households that perhaps have members who have disability, or households that have people who are elderly. In consideration of this, then we work around the levels of assessing affordability with them. The discussion is not just how much does the product cost, but the discussion is what are the mechanisms that households have used to acquire these key assets. So where is the key asset? How much does it cost in the market? Who provided it for them? Did they pay cash for it upfront? Was it something that they put up for themselves or not? And the assets range from mobile phones to beds to household furniture and all, okay? And then we measure the progress of the implementation through time. So I'm showing you a sample of how this is done in a country. So they identify several types of latrines, and this is based on our Tanzania data done last year. So these are the types of latrines that the households in these communities we work in identified. The material costs, the pit and the slab, and then the labor costs, looking again at the pit and the slab, and then the total. And this is Tanzania shillings. And the basis of this calculation, why we go up to slab level, we think that at superstructure, then it's an aspirational product. It's what the household desires. So to get consistency, at least up to slab level, you should be able to get that information across the countries. In this one then, we are looking at the comparison of these are the districts where the project, sample districts of the project is operating in Tanzania. These are the types of the latrines, and the key asset that they had selected was a bicycle. And then they put the cost of the bicycle here and the types of the latrines there. Now, when we were working in Tanzania, and that's the scale we use for measuring, moving from beyond reach, that is more than 80% of the communities are not able to afford the product. And in here, we are saying at least more than 80% of the communities are able to afford it. So we compare the costs of the latrine that the community has selected, and then we against the cost of the key asset, in this case the bicycle, and plot it against this graph. Okay, so just what I've described, the districts, the cost of the bicycle. In this instance, the communities opted for an improved pit latrine, improved traditional pit latrine. And from our calculations, we could see that it's predominantly affordable for most of the households. These are our results. So you can see that they are a mixed bag across the countries. So we almost have like 3 different scenarios. We have Zambia and Tanzania, where affordability is not quite an issue. We have countries, for example, Kenya, where we had a marginal drop. Uganda, it has maintained the same. So for these 2 countries, the barriers that we've had, especially for Uganda, has been related to technology. So the product is unaffordable because the technologies that are currently in the market are very expensive. So it's not quite just the issue of the cost. So in the analysis of our FGD, that's part of the information discovered. In Kenya, the main issue has been how the products are financed. And we are trying to look at the payment modalities that can be introduced in the market to make it easy for people to pay. And Nepal, where we had a significant increase in terms of the market, the team worked a lot on improving the efficiency of the value chain. So working to make sure that there are more private sector actors and there's more community outreach. So they introduced the concept of sanitation market cafes, which are sessions where the providers step out into the market and during public events and promote the products. So with the increase in supply of private sector, then the cost of the product also goes down. Ethiopia and Mozambique, again, this could also be part of the limitation of the tool that you're using. In the initial instance, they had focused on a simple pit latrine. But as we gained knowledge and the communities were better informed, in the next measurement period, they opted for a traditional improved bit. So of course, the price differentiation between the two means that it becomes more expensive. So the intervention we needed to work on was how to make the product cheaper. Lessons learned on two aspects. One on the affordability bit itself. So from the consumer side, I think the key message here is that the use of the key assets tool as a comparator of costs of affordability helps to demystify this concept. Because if you go out and straight away ask people, is this affordable? The answer would probably be yes or no. But if you use key assets, then you're able to compare against something else, and you can generate a conversation around barriers to access. On the supply side, that it's important to have knowledge around the context you're working in so that the products that are being supplied in the market are responsive to this. On the methodology, around the key assets, we say some of the key assets that are in that methodology are outdated. Variations in the assets. So it asks, do you have a mobile phone? It doesn't ask you what type of mobile phone it is. So a chair in one context might be something else, and in another, something. And then, of course, there is geographic differentiation of the assets that are owned. In terms of focus group discussions, I think a limitation of any qualitative research is about where do you find optimal information. You know, at what point or at what number of focus group discussions will you have reached the optimal information level? And lastly, it relies on a well-facilitated focus group discussion. So if that's not done well, then you'd be stuck. So the main conclusion we have is that affordability should not just be seen from a cost perspective. We need to look at sanitation from a value chain. So any inefficiencies that you can eliminate around the sanitation supply value chain would help to address the issue of affordability greatly. But if you just look at the cost, then it limits our processes. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we have a certain percentage of people who don't have access, the ones who are being left behind. And that usually constitutes, we hope, in our case, there will be about the 20%. So what kind of strategies do we have for these groups of people? So we have 3 levels here, and I'd like to invite my 2 colleagues to give a short overview of what we have done in some of this. So Teresa and then Kumplani. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. It's an honor for me to be here to say the story of Nandom District. My name is Teresa Swanzibafu, and I'm a WASH advisor in Ghana. And I'm currently coordinating the SSH4A project in Nandom, which is a district in Ghana. In 2014, when we started supporting the Nandom district, their total access to basic sanitation was at 47%. They've done a lot of work. As of 2018, around October, the district had moved from 47% to 96%. And basically, what are the things that we did? We sensitized them on demand creation. We did a bit of sensitization too on BCC campaign. There was BCC campaign, so to bring about behavioral change. And then for governance, Nandom had a very strong traditional presence, traditional authority presence that led in the campaign. And then again, we also looked at the supply component. But when we got to October, I realized that there was that component that Anne has mentioned that was still not being covered. That was still an issue. In Nandom district, realized that the elderly it was difficult to get to the elderly. So what did we do? Last year in June, the Ministry of Sanitation and Water Resources in Ghana introduced a pro-poor guideline, which is basically to see how the vulnerable could be targeted to ensuring that they have coverage to the basic sanitation services. So since last year, we're able to engage with the multi-stakeholder at the district level, which included the traditional leaders and then the MMDA that led in the process. And through that, they were able to identify key vulnerable persons to offer a bit of support in various stages. It could be the material support, or it could be even to improve participation of the vulnerable to ensure that they have access to sanitation. So that's what has been done, and the result is, as at December, NANDOM is now 100% ODF basic, which means that when it comes to behavioral change, when it comes to open defecation, NANDOM is not practicing open defecation. So we are in the process of finalizing the regional verification that also looks at latrine coverage, which will be done by the end of this month, and then by next month we'll be celebrating NANDOM as a model district that looked at implementing sanitation to improve the access and also looking at leaving no one behind. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kumbulani Ndlovu. I'm the watch sector leader for SNV in Zambia. I've also been working in this in the Rural Sanitation Project, which started in 2014. Now, the thing which we'd like to highlight from the Zambian experience is that after we started this project, we've done it in 2 phases. The first phase from 2014 to 2018, then from 2018 to current. What we observe is that there is a positive response when we do CLTS triggering. People build these toilets, and very good toilets which meet basic standards in terms of JMP. But we remain with a certain percentage which doesn't have these toilets. And when we look at the type of toilets in terms of cost, if you remember the slide which was shown by Anamuta, Zambia was one of those countries where it was saying it is affordable. So why is it that we've got a percentage which is failing to have the toilets when they are affordable? So what we have established is that there are basically 2 groups which are involved, which remain behind. That is the people with disabilities and also the elderlies. So you'll find that among people with disabilities and those with the elderly, in some cases they may be in a household which constructs a toilet, but they are unable to use that toilet because of the design. So the toilet is there, but they can't use it. So to them, it's a mirage. They will still go to the bush. And then in the other aspect, you have got the elderly or disabled maybe being head of households. And in that case, you find that maybe they don't have the manpower to construct a toilet. So what has been our response in order to address this problem? One of the things which we have done is to avail information on latrine options suitable for people with disabilities and even for the elderly who are having difficulties in moving. What we have also done is that we engage them. We find that when we are doing planning or preparatory meetings, they've been left out. So therefore, at local level, what is happening is that local meetings are now held closer to where they are, so that at least they could participate. One of the issues which we have faced from organizations representing people with disabilities is that they've been left out during planning, implementation, and monitoring sessions. So therefore, in order to ensure that they're involved, one of the things is to bring things like meetings closer to them. And then the other thing also is we've trained masons in those technology designs, so that if anyone wants support, then there is an available mason who can do the job. The other thing which we have also done in Zambia, there is a monitoring protocol which has been developed by the government of Zambia. Every month, data flows from the village level up to national level. And basically, they capture the household, the type of toilet, the number of people in that household, and so on. But what we've done as SNV is to make an adjustment on that protocol. We've added a column on capturing, are they disabled people, are they elderly people, so that we can match that the toilet facility which is in there also suits those type of people. Now, what are the results which are emerging? What we find out is that there is increased attention now to the needs of the disabled. They are not overlooked. people don't just say, now that we have a toilet, we now have 100% access or whatever. You may have the toilet, but other people are not using it. Secondly, also this data which we have, the data protocol which we have improved by adding these 2 columns on elderly and disability, our aim is to influence national level so that maybe this thing can be upscaled throughout the country. Because in the SDG agenda, what you are saying is leave no one behind. But you can't leave no one behind if you are not able to capture some of these groups. So therefore, you must make sure that your protocol covers everyone. Thank you.
Please feel free to download it from our website as indicated below. Thank you very much.
Go back to that slide, please. It means that if you came in late and you couldn't see Anne's presentation on the affordability comparison or the affordability indicator, you can read it in there. So now I would ask Anne, Kumbulani and Teresa to come here. We have a very short time for 3 questions from the floor. 1, 2, yes. I have one here, one here. This block is running behind. And one here.
Great. Thank you very much. My name is Ronnie. I'm with WaterAid East Africa. Thank you very much for your presentation and the great work that you're doing. I have a question on your slide on results, program findings, where you highlighted that there's low uptake or low results in Kenya because of the market segment, if I got you right. What is it that is happening in Kenya that is different from the other countries? That's what I want to understand.
We'll take 3 questions. But the third person, right?
Thank you very much. My name is Yao Ata Ahin. I work with World Vision International in Ghana. I think that the approach is already known, established. But what I want to find out is how is policy supporting the implementation of the community-led total sanitation approach towards ending open defecation in any of the countries that you talked about?
How is what?
How is policy?
Hello, my name is Michael Wolf. I'm working for JZ in Mali. And I would like to know a bit more about your marketing approach. You mentioned it, but it was not so much in detail. What is your opinion about the marketing effect and how do you do it? Maybe you can elaborate it a bit and also tell us maybe if there are differences between the different countries concerning marketing.
And now it's up to you to respond all of that in 3 minutes. Because we've been asked to compress everything, so please.
Okay, maybe I'll start with the one on the policy. How are the countries responding to, how is the policy responding to supporting the rollout of CLTS? So in the case of Zambia, right now as we speak, we have got the water and sanitation policy, which is still under draft. But despite that, you'll find that there is a lot which has been done by the government of the Republic of Zambia to support the rollout of CLTS. One, there is a national guideline towards that. And secondly, also in key national documents like the Rural Water Supply and Sanitation Strategy, there are key principles on sanitation. For example, which complement CLTS. One of the principles, for example, being that households must meet the cost of their own sanitation. And then there is also an open defecation-free strategy, which is also guiding implementers or actors on the ground.
Okay, so I'll take the 2 questions on the market and why there's low uptake in Kenya. So the issue is not about low uptake. The issue is about whether the product is affordable. And I'd said in Kenya that the main challenge that we were experiencing was that because of the seasonality of the incomes, most of the people could not pay upfront for the product. So they were looking for mechanisms in which they could pay in installments and be able to service it. So actually the team had tried out a mobile payment system, but then we realized that there were a lot of trust issues because they were sending money to the phone, and I think people want to, because of not sure whether the money is reaching the intended service provider, most of the people were not making the payments as expected. So we are currently looking at working with local groups where they can make contribution and where there is trust, so that the communities know each other, they can make that contribution to see if they are able to pay for the product. So there is that the product is expensive, the uptake is there, but it's slow. So how can they pay for it in installments? Because that's how the income comes in. In terms of, I think there's something about what we are working around in the market, and we said we are working around addressing issues, the barriers that exist. So for example, in most of the rural areas, people rely on, a poor example in this case, people rely on the grave diggers to do the digging for the pit. And usually these are people in the market, so the costing of that labor is not very clear. Secondly, there are issues around distances from the market, especially for remote households. So the travel distance increases the cost. So working to have outreach services or service providers who are able to go to these areas helps to reduce the cost. Thirdly is also around knowledge. Do people know what's available and where to get it? So you'd find you might have to go to at least 10 shops for you to be able to buy the total products or the total products that are needed for you to have a latrine. So is it possible for us to have one source where you can go and you can purchase what you need? And lastly, we are also looking at diversifying the options that are available. So it's not just looking at one type of toilet, but being able to provide a range of toilet options that the different actors or the different households can be able to access. So that's it, Antoinette. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. May I have a big applause? Assured that there will still be lunch for you afterwards. Now, we will be going to the second block, which is on urban sanitation here in, did you already get your clicker clear? Which is an urban sanitation here in informal settlements in South Africa. We should give it. We wanted to do a quick health break with you to make you run and see who is left behind, but we realize everybody is already running to the session, so we think you've run enough. So I would like to introduce Alana Potter, and she's the Director of Research and Advocacy of the Socioeconomic Rights Institute for South Africa. That is SERI, and SERI uses litigation and research and advocacy to assist communities to realize their socioeconomic rights. And she's going to start with a presentation, and after this we will have Kolili Notwala, who is the General Secretary of the Social Justice Coalition, which is a social movement to campaign for constitutional rights. So please do stay here. I see a lot of movements. It's a social movement. It's not about you moving around right now. Please do stay for the second block on informal settlements. Yes, Alana.
Taking a completely different angle, we imagine yourself flying out of a rural village into an informal settlement. So those of you who were On the field trip yesterday, we'll have some experience of this in the South African context, and those of you who didn't hopefully will by the end of the presentation. So the UN Special Rapporteur for Adequate Housing in October last year said that informal settlements represent a critical human rights challenge. Because on the one hand, informal settlements represent systemic human rights violations as a result of either action or inaction on the part of government, okay, and in terms of policy. But on the other hand, they also represent a profound and often incredible accomplishment, a profound expression of individuals, families, and communities claiming their rights and their right to housing. So that's what this presentation is premised on, is that in many of our efforts to talk about those left behind, people in the last mile, everyone marginalized, we don't really attempt to understand their livelihood strategies, their coping strategies, the agency, the norms and the practices of the people so-called left behind. They become this category of kind of what feels like strollers at the back of the pack, right? And I suppose what I want to say is that this is what this research is about trying to understand and characterize the lives of people that are in the so-called left behind category, okay? Sometimes people are left behind, it's not by accident, it's either because we do too much or because we do too little, and that's what this is about. Okay, you're not intended to hear all of this, but essentially, South Africa has a progressive legal and policy framework, which many of you will be aware of, and it's intended to redress the legacies and the laws of apartheid, okay? It's intended to correct imbalances, to enable land redistribution, to defend the rights of occupiers, and to provide services to people who were structurally and systemically, okay, left behind. Not by accident. Apartheid was by design. Okay, and in many countries, policies that seek to eradicate informal settlements rather than service them are intentional. They're policies. They're not inactions. They're not accidental. They're policies. Okay. People were forcibly evicted and structurally and systemically left behind for more than half a century in South Africa, and so our legal framework is aimed at addressing that. Important in the set of laws, so you have the Constitution, the Housing Act, you heard bits and pieces of the Constitution in the plenary today, you have the Housing Act, the Water Services Act, all of these things give people rights. But the interesting one for the research today is about the Upgrading Informal Settlements Act, program, which is essentially part of the Housing Act. So it's a law in South Africa that compels municipalities to upgrade informal settlements in situ. Okay? So rather than flattening them and relocating them and starting a new township, to provide sites and services and top structure housing to informal settlement residents where they are. Okay? So, and behind all of these laws, as you know, are financing mechanisms and an institutional framework. So there's a large grant that gets given from National Treasury to municipalities called the upgrading, what's it called? The Urban Settlements Development Grant. I always get that confused. The USDG, which is allocated from National Treasury to municipalities to make this happen, to implement this piece of legislation. And so having a look at who is left behind in South Africa, and I'll be quite brief about this. So between democracy in 1994 and now, so over the last 25 years, there's been concerted infrastructure development, okay, and housing and services, which has seen some massive and impressive achievements, okay. So we have something like 90% of the population has access to piped water. When we talk about piped water, we mean an improved water source, not piped water to the dwelling. So it could be a borehole or a hand pump or, communal services. And something in the region of 65% of people with access to flush toilets. We should be celebrating in the streets, right? Because this is extraordinary. A lot of money has been spent, a lot of targets have been met. But the people that are left behind are properly left behind. They've been left behind for 25 years. And they don't just live everywhere, they live in very specific places. They live in rural settlements and they live in informal settlements, okay? More than a quarter of the people living in rural settlements in South Africa do not have access to improved sanitation. To improved water supply, and more than half don't have access to improved sanitation. That's the same as the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, right? Despite concerted infrastructure development. And they have been left behind for at least 25 years, if not longer. 3 other quite important points around that are that for the first time 2 years ago, we started to get information on the quality of infrastructure and the reliability of services, as well as essentially downtime, right? And what we found from that data for the first time in 23 years, we got the data. Most of us don't monitor functionality. We just monitor whether there's a tap, not whether it works. Is there a toilet? Is it used? Was that there was a direct inverse relationship between the poverty headcount and the quality of infrastructure, the reliability of the service, and the length of downtime. Okay, so all over the world, and with South Africa no exception, and this is one of the outcomes of the Wash Cost project: 5 years, 5 countries. The poorer you are, the more you pay for poorer quality services all over the world. Okay, and that's no different in South Africa either. All right. According to the World Bank, South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. Okay. And all of these statistics about achievements kind of obscure some profound inequalities. All right, and it is exactly what they say. The UNDP says, if you want to understand who is left behind and why, you start to look at discrimination, place of residence, socioeconomic status, governance, and vulnerability to shocks. Those are some of the 5 factors that help us understand who is left behind and why. And in South Africa, it's people living in rural areas and informal settlements. We all know the Ngor commitment signed by African ministers, #1, in Dakar in 2015. So it's not accidental. So why am I really here to talk to you? Well, we've done some ethnographic research over the last 2 years in order to understand what exists in 3 informal settlements, and I'll tell you a bit more about them. From there, we're developing a synthesis report, and we'll do some policy briefs. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of introduce what exactly we're doing. So this is quite important. Where did we do this research? Whoops. How do you go back? No, you do that, right. And the pointer is this thing. Which thing is the pointer? This thing, right. So the first one this is in Klerksdorp, Ratenang. It's an informal settlement in the northwest of the province. There's another settlement in Sianda. Everyone's heard of eThekwini, right? If you haven't heard of eThekwini, you've never been to Africa Sam before. So, okay, eThekwini's Durban, where the first eThekwini commitments were signed in 2008. This is an informal settlement in Sianda, in eThekwini. And then, if you haven't heard of Cape Town, then you also need a little bit of help. Here we are, Marikana. You were in. It's going to take a bit more than that. You were in Philippi yesterday. If you went on a field trip, this is one of the settlements in Philippi called Marikana. It is a lot bigger than the settlement you saw. This has got 60,000 people. And it's based in Cape Town. So we looked at these 3 settlements. In those settlements, we did research on land use and tenure, political space, livelihoods, and basic services. I'm going to give you a very quick snapshot of the 3 things and then delve in a little more detail into political space. The big question is, why did we do this research? Well, it comes back to that question of why is only 50% of the money spent that's there to upgrade informal settlements? We have this great policy framework, and yet metropolitan municipalities send back half of the grant and are not upgrading informal settlements. There are almost no examples of settlements that are upgraded in keeping with the upgrading informal settlements program. There's very little evidence of that happening. Lots of frustration in terms of attempts to engage the state and get settlements upgraded, get services provided. The other thing is that government is geared for a greenfield approach. Bulldoze it and put in a township. Okay? What they're not geared for is upgrading in situ by providing sites and services and building on people's livelihoods. Okay? What they're geared for is the MDGs: eradicate and start again. Okay, and essentially that's government doing too much. All right, and so if upgrading is to meaningfully build on what exists, then what does exist? And these were the research questions that we set about answering. How should it engage with local norms, agency, and practice? What's the nature of local realities in these settlements? What practices characterize daily life in these settlements? So this is what we set about doing, and I'm going to give you a very brief snapshot. Welcome. I was just going to tease Virginia for being late, but all right, okay. So you've arrived in the midst of an incredibly busy slide, but essentially what this is a snapshot. Hopefully it's not a slapshot. It's a snapshot of what we found in these three settlements, but with respect to land use and tenure. Informal settlements are often associated with lawlessness, with disorder, with criminality, with people living off the register, undeserving of public investment or human dignity. According to the MDGs, informal settlements should simply be eradicated. What we found was not this, okay? What we found was, in fact, a very clear sort of set of local norms and practices about who could build shacks, how many shacks, for what purpose, with what numbering systems, who could bring family members in, under which circumstances, when, how big the settlement could get. So what we found really was the opposite of lawlessness. We found settlements where great effort was placed on managing occupation and by committees who worked within the settlements and by people who lived within the settlements themselves in order to contain and manage the land tenure, the land use and security of these settlements. So that's a big snapshot just to make you think it's not really the purpose of my presentation at all. The other piece was around political space. Political space could be more comfortably called community participation or public participation, but essentially one of the things we found with respect to a political space is that the judicial space was absolutely critical, okay? That all of these settlements had essentially had won the right to stay through the courts. Okay. Otherwise, they would have been relocated, displaced, and evicted. Okay. It was neither invented nor invited. Sometimes we have these big academic debates about, is it invited spaces that make the difference? Is it formal government participatory mechanisms, or is it informal? Is it about protest? Is it about, is it about invented spaces? Is it about people that pressure for change? The truth is both were needed, and both were needed a lot and continue to be needed. But until there was a court case, municipalities simply didn't act in most cases. I understand that, and it's going to run longer than that. Okay, so land occupation represents material and symbolic claims to belonging and dignity. Okay, the politics of belonging was expressed as central to how people perceive their struggle and their social relationships. All right, moving on to the last piece that isn't basic services, and this has to do with livelihoods, okay? We found three things, okay? People make a livelihood predominantly in informal settlements through informal work, including wage labor, and subsisted in the South African context on social grant networks. There were a range of informal work activities, everything from hair salons to small-scale manufacturing, shoe manufacture, to shoe fixers, dressmakers, all sorts of things. All of them were dependent on two critical things. The one was roads and the other was services. Okay? So water, sanitation, electricity, footfall, and the ability to transport goods and services were absolutely essential to people's livelihoods in informal settlements that we studied. Okay. So moving on to the territory that we usually look at. It's quite, anyone who's an O&M enthusiast will find this very interesting. I'm looking particularly at you, George. So these are photographs of how the community had maintained its hand pump over a number of years in the Ratanang informal settlement, the only water source in the entire settlement. You can see different examples of efforts that have been made to keep the water source running. Okay, I think the point is, if we want to face the reality that if we're designing strategies to reach the poorest of the poor, it is always going to take effort and it is always going to take money. And I think that's the first thing that we need to look in the eye. But I will elaborate on that. The extent to which that effort and money is put in by communities themselves or their providers, or by the municipalities or their providers, kind of can place you along a continuum between self and municipal supply, which I'll elaborate on a bit further. So what did we find? So we found in Ratanang, which is the settlement in the northwest, just to remind you, in Klerksdorp, absolutely no municipally provided services. Okay, we found that residents had stepped into the vacuum, local artisans undertook hand pump repairs, dug unimproved pit latrines, undertook waste recycling, collected water and firewood for a small fee for other residents. Residents had frequent diarrhea, they were vulnerable to fire, they spent significant time and energy collecting firewood and water, and incurred high costs with respect to paraffin because there was no electricity supplied, and to maintain their own water source. Okay? So profoundly poor people, absolutely no services. Marikana is in Philippi, which is where some of you were yesterday. What did we find in Marikana? I'm not going to elaborate a lot on this because Axolile, who's from the Social Justice Coalition, is going to speak a lot more about informal settlement sanitation in Cape Town. So I'm not going to elaborate on this much, except to say that Day zero is the daily reality of informal settlement residents in Cape Town and all over South Africa. Okay? So when we go, 25 litres a day and I have to queue for it, this is what people live with every single day. Essentially, one of the biggest findings we had was that people just felt that services were provided with complete anonymity and disdain where they were provided. They simply just felt like the message sent by government was, you don't belong here. Right. So just to mention that in Marikana, after a court battle, the city of Cape Town has been ordered to expropriate the land on which the Marikana settlement is situated so that they can upgrade and provide services. It's the Fisher case, in case anybody's interested in that. What about Sianda? Okay. So the eThekwini municipality, as many of you will know, has won numerous awards for its prestige, including the prestigious Stockholm Water Award for its innovative communal ablution blocks, which comprise gender desegregated blocks with showers, basins, flush toilets within a few hundred meters of most shacks. I know a lot of work is looking at ablution facilities and how well they work. Our main finding in Sianda was that the provision of these services gave people hope of future upgrading and housing, that they were connected to a municipal grid. Okay, gave people a sense that their tenure was secure and that their dignity was intact. Communal ablution facilities are serviced by caretakers connected to supervisors and maintenance teams selected by the community and ward councillors and paid for by an expanded public works program. So interesting here that even though we found that there was caretakers in place, so the whole thing around why SDG, shared sanitation, is not counted as safely managed in the SDGs, because it's impossible to allocate responsibility for caretaking. Even where that caretaker had been allocated, people continued to use pit latrines, to dig and build and use pit latrines in their own yards. Privacy, safety, and nighttime accessibility were absolutely key. You'll be thrilled to know I've only got 2 more slides. The next one is, so I said that we could place it along a typology, if you like. So these 3 settlements between sort of municipal and self-supply, we can put them along a typology. But all three of these municipalities in eThekwini, in Klerksdorp, and in Cape Town, have the same policy and legal framework, have access to the same financing mechanisms, to the same amount of money, have the same kind of pressures. Why did they respond so differently? Right? What makes the difference between these municipalities? Why are some providing interim services? Why are some providing temporary services? And why are some providing no services? We can only really speculate, but we know in eThekwini there's been a lot of stuff. There's been very strong municipal leadership. There's been good innovation. Where's Teddy? I don't think Teddy counted. Okay, good innovation. There's been a lot of politics. Abaklali, you can wave now, Virginia. There's a lot of pressure, a lot of politics, a lot of protest, a lot of innovation, a lot of leadership. The reality is that at this end of the continuum, self-supply places significant strain on local resources. This is not the most popular message to be giving here, but it is true. And this deepens the vulnerability of vulnerable groups, okay? To provide, 1 more minute, I'm nearly there. Whereas on this side, contractors or supply-driven infrastructure programs can essentially flatten livelihoods, right? So on one end of the continuum, you're seeing government do too little, and on the other end, doing too much, okay? Communities are resourceful and they're resilient, they make creative adaptations, And these norms, agencies, and practices can be built on while we upgrade these settlements. And now for my very last slide, the big question is, why are people left behind? Is it about a lack of finance? Not in the South African context, it's not about a lack of finance. There's no doubt. However, is it political will? There's no doubt that leaving rural and informal settlement residents behind has lower immediate political and financial impact on municipalities, right, than leaving behind on-register voters, okay? However, that's a bit short-sighted because we know there's growing discontent, protest and social action against poor services received by poor people. The next question that's asked by this research is what services and where, because this is absolutely critical. There are clearly strong links between land use, tenure, livelihoods, and basic services. The productive use of services is essential to help people escape poverty, right? So greater quantities of water and power closer to households are needed to enable this. And it's no good putting a housing program somewhere in the middle of nowhere because you will not break the cycle of poverty because people will be stuck without access to economic opportunities. So where you develop housing and services really matters. Again, quoting the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, she said, the world has come to accept the unacceptable. It is a human rights imperative that informal settlements be upgraded to basic standards of human dignity. What is clear here is that there will be concerted efforts and money, policy changes, moving from eradicating to upgrading in situ is going to be needed. But what is essentially needed is a change in how we see and treat the poor. Okay? If we want to reach everyone left behind, we need to change how we see and treat the poor, both the urban and the rural poor. It's clear that we need good data, we need blended financing mechanisms, integrated planning, and a nuanced approach towards enabling and regulating the private sector. And there's more to be read. And before I get absolutely thrown off the podium, I'm going to ask Akwanile to please come up and talk about the Social Justice Coalition. And Antoinette would also...
Yes, I am here.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm an activist, and so I would say good afternoon, comrades. And I would start with a song, but you'd have to learn Xhosa for you to understand the songs that I would sing. So I work for the Social Justice Coalition, which is a social movement as was introduced, campaigning for the rights of those living in informal settlements. And some of our campaigns, because we live in the city of Cape Town, have been directed to the city of Cape Town, especially with regards to sanitation services, and also with regards to safety, which means have been directed to the South African Police Service. This sanitation campaign, which we ran for a number of years, I think since 2008 as the Social Justice Coalition, started to touch on something which we believed many people didn't look into, the connection between the lack of access to sanitation and safety, where many people living in informal settlements are vulnerable to crime, especially women and children. The rate of sexual assault when people have to travel long distances to relieve themselves in open fields or to toilets that do not exist or toilets that are very far. And so when this campaign started, it was centered around making sure that we create safe communities by making sure that we provide dignified, clean, safe, and dignified sanitation services to people living in informal settlements. And so since early 2010, we campaigned and raised awareness in the city of Cape Town. Many of you coming from elsewhere, you would see and find Cape Town as a very beautiful city, but you're in one part of the city of Cape Town. There's a whole another Cape Town, which I think Elana started to touch on when talking about the informal settlement, which is Marikana. 30 kilometers away from here is a township known as Khayelitsha, one of the biggest townships in South Africa, which has a lot of informal settlements, a number of informal settlements. And the people that keep this city clean, that keep this building clean, I recently now before this session met someone who lives in Khayelitsha who's working here. And that person is gonna go home and that person will not have a toilet while they are keeping this beautiful city clean and making sure that the toilets are clean here. And so that's the reality of the inequalities that you find, not only in the city of Cape Town. It might be worse in Cape Town because of spatial apartheid and where people live, but that's the reality that you find in South Africa. And again, from what Alana spoke about, it's not that there's no money. It's that there's been numerous excuses, what the city calls constraints when it comes to providing services in informal settlements. And these are all the excuses that are used by government, that people are living on privately owned land, and that is highly dense, it's under power lines, and all those other excuses. And so again, if you were to go towards Khayelitsha, you would see that these are just excuses. Because when you go past the airport, and you would have seen the airport, and across the airport, there's a huge informal settlement. And so how do you explain having a world-class airport that has sanitation facilities, but across the road, you're saying there's all these constraints and you can't provide services? So it goes back to political will more than anything. It's about the politics and talking about sanitation and toilets being political in many ways. And we do, as an organization, acknowledge that some of these constraints exist and some of them might be real, but it's not that it's impossible to overcome. It might mean that it's you providing more money. That means having to take money elsewhere and making sure that it's provided where it's needed. And so just some facts with regards to sanitation and what types of toilets are provided in informal settlements. And one of the big issues, again, which since 1994, when we had just about, I think, 200 informal settlements. We have over 2,700 informal settlements in South Africa currently. And there's been this idea and this notion of thinking about the eradicating of informal settlements. Therefore, when you go to informal settlements in terms of the types of services that are provided, these are temporary services because informal settlements are seen as temporary. And therefore, government is not investing in providing proper infrastructure because informal settlements have to be eradicated. Because as soon as you invest in providing infrastructure, you're acknowledging that these are permanent areas, which is what government should be acknowledging. Because when you treat informal settlement residents as temporary, you're essentially treating them as second-class citizen, which means you're saying they do not belong in this beautiful city of Cape Town. So you can see in terms of the types of toilets that are provided that the focus is still on eradicating informal settlements. What Ilana was talking about, that you want to clear informal settlements and you want everything to be formal. In the informal settlements, this is some data which we got from the city of Cape Town. There's chemical toilets, container toilets, portable flush toilets. Those are some of the most controversial toilets in Cape Town, known as PFTs. And you can see the numbers, that 66% of toilets that are provided in over 204 informal settlements in Cape Town are all temporary. And most of these are culturally and socially unacceptable, because these are some of the people that are living in one-room shacks, very poor people, one-room shacks. They have to live with what is essentially a bucket toilet inside that house, with families, households that can have children and up to 5 and 10 people living in one house. And also, many of the informal settlements have existed for over 15 years in these informal settlements in Cape Town, but they still have these types of services. So you cannot actually say an informal settlement that has existed for 15 years or more and still regard that informal settlement as temporary. And so these are just, again, some of the facts. We've actually gotten data, and this is a website where we've collected all the data for informal settlements in Cape Town and put it in this website to show how informal settlements residents live. And we've put up some stories of people who have lived there. This is someone that has lived in an informal settlement since 1999, and that informal settlement is still regarded as temporary. And she's lived there almost her life, almost all of her life with her family. Can you go to the other tab? And again, when you're talking about people being left behind, you can see people living with disabilities don't have those buckets, those things there are supposed to be toilet that people are supposed to be using. So you can think about someone who's disabled, and those things are left outside. They're not even in a structure. Some of you might have heard or might have known about toilets that were built without walls in the city of Cape Town. And those were toilets that were built in Khayelitsha, and people were expected to use those types of toilets. So if you can go to this website, it shows all the informal settlements in Khayelitsha. You can click in one informal settlement. It will give you the population of the people living there. It will give you the age of the informal settlement. It will give you the number of temporary versus permanent sanitation facilities. And you would see that what I'm talking about is not only limited to the one informal settlement I made an example of. It's all the informal settlements that exist in Khayelitsha. So in conclusion, I mean, all the facts are there and all the numbers are there, and Elana spoke about most of the issues that exist in other cities as well. Can you go to the last slide, please? So what we've been saying in conclusion is that the biggest issue is that is the issue of political will, and it goes to the issue that if you treat informal settlements as temporary, then you're not going to plan for them. In Cape Town, since Cape Town existed, there's never been a plan to make sure that informal settlements are taken into consideration. Cape Town has a budget of about 50 billion rand annually, but over 204 informal settlements in the city that exist are not planned for. And therefore, when you don't plan for people, then you don't implement, and then you don't provide. And so what we've been saying, essentially, what is needed is that through sufficient and meaningful participation from all the communities that exist, especially those living in informal settlements, the city must develop a reasonable citywide plan for the provision of clean, safe, and dignified sanitation services to all informal settlements. And those plans must be linked to reasonable budgets and timelines, because we know government can plan and say, I'm going to build you houses, and this house, building these houses or these toilets is going to take 20 years. That's not reasonable for people who've already lived for more than 20 years without access to basic services. But again, more importantly, which is something that Alana touched on, is that this cannot be done without acknowledging that these people exist here. And for you to acknowledge that people exist and they deserve to live in Cape Town, you must make sure that you provide tenure security, so that these people have something to say, I belong here, I belong in the city of Cape Town, and I can be able to, even once I get tenure security, I can be able to build for myself. Because as soon as someone from an informal settlement now builds for themselves without tenure security, there's what is called the anti-land invasion unit. They can come and demolish your house and evict you and tell you that you don't have the right to be building because you don't have tenure security. So if we are to move towards dignity and safety for the most vulnerable in our cities, this is what we believe has to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Akolili. So we have formally 5 minutes left, because at 1:15 the award session is going to start. However, we have always also a lingering doubt whether it will actually start at 1:15 sharp. That is why we are proposing to you as an audience that we will do our planned panel for 10 minutes in which you can ask questions to all the presenters. People who feel very worried that they will miss the award session and will be late, they are of course free to run out. Yes? So may I have Anne here and Alana and Aksholili. I really need to practice that. And also Rafael Mua. And you haven't met Rafael Mua yet. He is a program officer of the Institute of Economic Affairs from Kenya. And the Institute of Economic Affairs is a think tank that promotes informed discussions about public policy in Kenya. So they do research, they do public education, and they use that to influence decision making. I don't know if we have sufficient stools to make it equal. Yes. Thank you for the participation of the panel. So let me start by asking Rafael, because he hasn't spoken yet, just to share with us a little bit which strategies have worked in your country, and then I'll give the floor to all of you to ask any questions that you would like.
Thank you very much.
It's off.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. But let me say this before I mention two things about the strategies that are working in Kenya. I'm working in a voice for change project where our main goal is to advocate for enhanced or increased resources in sanitation. And Kenya is, in terms of governance, we have two structures. We have the national government and we have the county government. But you realize that when it comes to allocating resources toward sanitation, it is a devolved function. And therefore, if you want to track down how resources are allocated, in Kenya, you just track the county government. The national government purely deals with policy formulation. Now, what is IEA, or Institute of Economic Affairs, have been doing for the last 3 years, 2 years, in terms of strategies? One of the things that we have done, or we have been able to do, is that we have realized that if you want to work better with the data, you have to ensure that you involve the local communities, so that if you are engaging them in terms of focus group discussion, you are involving them in terms of surveys, involve them, so that in terms of uptake of that information that you want to generate, it becomes easier for you to engage them and even to engage with the policymakers. Number two is that we have been able to do research. And one of the research that we have done is on effects of poor sanitation. Yes, you can do research, fine. But you need to develop products. And one of the products that we have done is that we have been able to develop products like something like geospatial map. Geospatial maps tell you in a very clear way. For example, in Kenya, we have a county like Homa Bay County. It tells you the prevalence rates of diarrhea. It becomes easier to sell that information to the county government officials. Number two, we have come up with easier products like sheet flow diagram, something like a policy brief that synthesizes that information that you want to share with the county officials. And finally, in terms of what we have been able to do is to create that personal rapport between the county government officials and even the national government officials on what is happening in terms of sanitation. And therefore, building that relationship, it doesn't come easy. You have to sacrifice your time and ensure that whatever products that you are generating, actually you can be able to have even a one-on-one conversation with the government officials so that they are able to uptake the information that you have as a policy, as a think tank, as a guy who advocates for policy issues in Kenya. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rafael. So we see a very diverse range of realities, rural, urban, different countries, where people work to ensure the right or to help realize the right to sanitation. The floor is yours to ask all these people any question. So, this block is clearly the most active. It's not left behind. Could you wait? Could you please give me the mics so I control who speaks? Go ahead.
Good afternoon to the audience and to the panel. Alana, okay, my name is Rihanna. I'm from South Africa, and I'm also working in the Northwest, in the Zeerust area, which is neighboring to Botswana. I just want to say that we are busy with a big rural sanitation program. Luckily in South Africa, there's subsidies to do a program for 3 years, so it's not once-offs. So there in Zeerust, we were busy with this rural sanitation. And luckily, there were this progressive speaker, councillor on the council there of the bigger Zeerust. And there was this informal settlement. It's called Extension 3. It has quite a history. And we started to discuss and with the community, and we know that they're going to formalize it. And we thought, let's link on. And for every shack there in Extension 3, we did a pour flush toilet. So we are climbing the ladder to flush toilets, but I think it was the political will of this councillor, and luckily the supplier, contractor were also progressive, and there was money available, and there was the buy-in from the community. So I think there's definitely some positives. So I want to invite Ilana and activist friend, please come and invite us there in Northwest at Zeerust. Okay, if I just can ask one second question from the practitioners. Okay, we are still very busy with VIP toilets, double pits at this stage. And it's the rainy season in South Africa now. So if you can help me, it's not that the VIP pits are stinking. We've did about 200,000 toilets, so I think I know the smell. But it's damp. There's a damp smell. So, and the people are not unhappy, but the health workers, the practitioners keep on asking me, what can we do about this damp smell? So I say to all of them, I'm coming here this week, I'm going to ask those who know the answer. So please help me that I can go with an answer back. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Atta Benson. I work with an NGO called Community Emergency Response Initiative, and also happen to be the national coordinator of the Civil Society Network on Water and Sanitation, and by the grace of God, the chairperson of the Board of Trustees of African Civil Society Network. For the last speaker, I'll just provide you the solution. In my country, what we do with such situation, get the people to use to pour ashes. Every morning, once they sweep, they pour the ash. Within a very short time, the smell will go off. It dries up the toilet and makes it last longer, and then makes it also remove the heat. So the ash from firewood does that trick, pouring the ashes in it. Then I have comment for our colleagues there. The last but one presenter. With regards to some of the situation we are experiencing, because what you are experiencing is doesn't only apply to your country here, it applies to most of the African countries. And the first or major challenge we have is getting people to engage offices that they know nothing about. That is the first challenge we have. And with that, they come into office, they don't know what to do, and fortunately, they don't engage professionals to advise them or to help them in whatever idea they have. And another challenge we have is somebody wakes up with an idea without researching on it and just throws it out, and at the end of the day, such ideas fail. Sometimes I'm not trying to speak for the policymakers, but this is what we've come to discover, that most of those occupying that are supposed to be policymakers don't have knowledge about what they're expected to do. So it is for us to create opportunity to bring them together and indirectly let them learn from such forum, which we organize, because this is what we come to realize over time. For political interest, somebody is put in a particular position just to certify him for make up for whatever contribution he might have made in getting him to power. But in the real sense, the person doesn't know what to do. And unfortunately, they make promises before they get to such position, and they don't plan for it. So at the end of the day, they forget about all this. And if you bring up policies before them, they don't know what to do, and except you first educate them, enlighten them on what is expected, because the implication of the different conditions that comes out in the different poor environment, they are not known. So first, we have to continue to enlighten the policymakers. We have to continuous enlightenment, continuous advocacy will help us solve some of this problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Last question of this.
Thank you. Anthony Ojili, University of KwaZulu-Natal. My question is twofold, and it goes to Elena and the comrade. So my question is, first, what's the role of civil society in terms of resource reuse? So we've heard about a lot of novel ideas this morning, and how is civil society kind of, will I say, promoting or trying to build support for resource reuse in terms of recycled water or things like that around sanitation. On the other hand, also protecting the poor, that these ideas or products are, they do not end up being like dumped on the poor. So it's twofold. How are you protecting as well as how you're promoting this?
Thank you very much. So maybe I'm taking 3 questions, and they were first. So Alana, Kolile, maybe you could start.
Is it on? Okay. So I think we all have a role. I think we all have a role beyond just people who are in civil society in terms of reusing the resources that we have. We know what's happening in the world globally, and we all have a role. But I think ours is not, again, and I think you've said, is not to go and impose certain services to people. It's all about, again, in what I said in my presentation, acceptability. Socially, it must be acceptable, and people have to accept that they can be able to use this. Because the way inequality works is that certain people have a certain standard and certain people have a certain standard. And therefore, if you don't give, and this might be controversial, but if you don't give rich white people in Cape Town PFTs, why do you have to give black poor people PFTs? And you expect them to be able to accept them if rich white people are not going to be accepting them. And so our role is to make sure that we treat each and everyone equally at the same level, and make sure that the resources that we give to everyone are at an equal standard. And so that's the role of civil society, is not to impose, is to make sure that people are able to accept through meaningful participation, are able to accept these resources. But I'm still not sure how to be able to deal with the bigger issue, which is political will, to make sure that there's resources first before you can get people to reuse them.
Just very briefly to add to that, I mean, obviously I'm summarizing a huge amount of research in a very short space, but a lot of people in informal settlements subsisted in doing waste recycling. So solid waste recycling was a huge informal activity that sustained many livelihoods. A bigger one obviously was spaza shops, but informal waste recycling was a big deal.
Maybe let him start and then. On political will.
How to generate political investments.
Take them to court.
She's giving me an answer. But I think in terms of political will, my experience personally is that this requires personal initiative where you engage with the political leaders so that your issues can be heard. And therefore, it is important, even as you carry out advocacy work, to ensure that in terms of engaging with the political leaders, you engage them at particular levels and understanding where is the right time to engage with the political leaders. For example, in Kenya, I think the right avenue is through their committees, where they normally have discussions. And that one will, perhaps in terms of sharing out issues, it will be a critical point where you can be able to advocate for perhaps research materials that you may be having, and this will move your issue or your agenda to the next level. Perhaps I can mention another thing that I forgot in terms of what we normally do to ensure that our strategies are being heard is usual social audit. So I think social audit helps in trying to track out some of the programs. For example, if you have a program that is being implemented at the county level, what we normally do is to involve the communities to track themselves using social audit to see whether those programs are being implemented. And of course, involvement of people with disabilities to ensure that the uptick of work is on the higher side. So thanks.
Yeah, I think when we are talking to politicians, one of the big issues we have realized is in relation to generating sufficient evidence that can be used to engage them or create that emotional attachment to the issues that are being faced. And I think in the work that we were doing in Ghana, for example, while we had the district being in charge of pushing the agenda, we worked closely with the traditional leadership who seem to have more moral authority on the communities. And even the politicians themselves tend to listen to these traditional leaders. So I think it's also to find suitable persons or organizations in the communities that these political leaders respect and to dialogue with them or to create an environment where dialogue can be generated and they can also be exposed to the issues that are being faced for them to understand from the human perspective the challenges that are being faced with communities.
Thank you all very much. I think I can't, there's a risk if I keep you longer that there won't be lunch, so I will not do that. Never stand between an audience and a lunch, they say. But could you please give a big applause to all the people? And I hope that you will be, that you'll keep following the Leave No One Behind track and that you'll keep thinking and working on realizing this right to sanitation. Thank you.